And thank you, Wendy. I appreciate you guys having me. Can you hear me okay? Great. Um, just going to run through a variety of things here and then happy to take your questions as Whitney mentioned. A quick introduction to Adirondack Worm Farm. We use red wiggler worms to do vermicomposting. They're the most popular and common type of worm for composting. We offer a curbside composting service up in the Glens Falls, Lake George area. We also raise European night crawlers, which the Boy Scout camp in Washington County, the boys really love using those European night crawlers as bait worms. Um, we introduced ourselves formally to the world in 2019, but I've been working with worms for more than 5 years now, and from the full size to the babies and all of the. But I just had a really nice shot of some food waste that we had that was going to the worms, so wanted to throw that in there. Um, Briefly, a couple of terms. Vermiculture refers to raising and cultivating worms in a controlled setting. And one of the things I'm going to talk about is really using a worm bin. This is not something that you would do really outdoors unless you had a lot of particular um, uh, caveats and things in place to protect the worms. Vermicomposting, Whitney's already said, is using worms to convert organic waste into fertilizer. The red wigglers, there's about 9,000 species of worms in the world. There's only about a handful, maybe 6 or 7, that are composting worms. These guys are different than what you might find after a rainstorm on the sidewalk or your driveway. There's a distinct classifications of worms, and the ones that burrow deep into the soil are great and very good and help indicate a healthy soil, but they're not composting worms. And the composting worms don't dig and burrow deep in. They actually live just in the top couple of inches of the soil, and their sole purpose is to break down the decaying organic matter. And then just very briefly, worms actually, when they mate, they lay cocoons, and then 1 to 3 baby red wigglers are born out of each cocoon, and you can see one of the cocoons there next to a worm. Pretty small, but the worms have good appetite. In this case, I think a lot of you may be familiar with vermicomposting, but in the broader public, most people aren't. They haven't really heard of it. So I always say, is this some sort of new fad? Is this the current elixir of the day that's going to solve everything? It's not, and it's not going to solve everything, but it is a powerful source of assistance. Aristotle, way back when, called earthworms the intestines of the soil. Charles Darwin had written that without the work of this humble creature, agriculture as we know it would be very difficult, if not wholly impossible. In 1941, Time magazine had a story praise for the earthworms. And for folks that are interested, really the best material out there for home vermicomposters is a book by Mary Applehoff in Michigan, Worms Eat My Garbage. She published it in 1982. It's still one of the best books for a good overview, very easily approachable, written in plain English. It's not a scientific book in that sense, but it does talk about the principles and the science behind what the worms do. So I can't recommend it enough if anyone's interested in learning more. There's a couple of problems. One of them is that we keep adding to the landfills, and we really don't need to, but we do. So if you look at the chart here, it's a chart from EPA. Between 1960 and 2015, this is the amount of material that went into municipal solid waste, basically what was thrown in the trash can and ended up in a landfill. In 1960, there was about 12 million tons was generated, and all 12 million tons went to the landfill because there really wasn't anything else to do. This chart is a little misleading in that it doesn't have a recycling component. But if you figure that recycling goes in a different can and just look at what goes in the garbage pail and ends up at the landfill, by 2000, there was 680,000 tons of waste was composted. Not bad, getting started. But and there was 5 million tons went to waste to energy facilities, but there was still more than double, 24 million tons was landfilled compared to 1960, and that's because it almost doubled, or more than doubled, almost tripled in 2000, the amount of material that was generated as trash. And if you shoot over to 2015, that's now close to $40 million in 20, or 40 million tons in 2015, and I'm sure it's well over that now by 2020. Even with 2 million tons being composted, there's still 30 million tons that's ending up in the landfills. And it doesn't need to be, because 30 to 40% of residential garbage is biodegradable. It can be composted, it can be vermicomposted. It doesn't need to end up in a landfill. And a third of the food that's produced is wasted, all the way from in the fields where it's left to rot for a variety of different reasons. It's just not, it costs more for the farmers sometimes to bring it to market, or there was storm damage and it's just not saleable. All the way to the end user, where you forget about something left over in your back of your refrigerator, and then you open it up and that's got to go. Um, but when stuff like that goes to the landfill, it ends up creating methane gas, because it's an anaerobic process that's going on in the landfill. And methane is the landfills rather, is the third largest source of methane release in the US. And methane gas is much more harmful greenhouse gas than carbon. Another problem is the increasing concerns about farm fertilizer runoff at large farms. And part of the problem here, and I always, when I talk about this, say that, I am a big fan of farmers. I have a lot of respect for them. So I do not in any way disparage farmers. But between 92 and 2012, the US lost 31 million acres of farmland. So the farmers that are remaining have to grow as much or more crops on less acreage. And what do? They're using fertilizer, mostly synthetic fertilizer. And in the University of California study showed that 50% of nitrogen from synthetic fertilizers is wasted. And part of the reason for that is because these nitrogen is put together in this chemical makeup that's really difficult for plants to uptake. So what they have to do is put more nitrogen than the plants really need, so that by the time the plants are able to take up enough nitrogen to see a growth boost, a bunch of that other nitrogen has washed away. And so that's also why if you put too much chemical fertilizer on your baby plants, you're going to burn them, because it's too much fertilizer, it's too much nitrogen for them all at once. But what do you do when you have that runoff of the nitrogen? You've got now problems with rural wells, water wells that are being poisoned with too much of the chemical runoff. So how do you grow more crops on less land and don't use chemicals? I would suggest that vermicomposting is at least part of the solution. This is not, going to solve the world in 80 days or anything like that. But composting worms can consume anything that was once alive, anything at all. And I include this picture here because this is dryer lint. And if you use, if you're washing and drying things, cotton socks and underwear and things, anything that was made with a natural fiber, you wouldn't think of clothes as having been alive. But if they were made with cotton or other natural fibers, that material grew, it was once alive, and the worms will consume it. So here's worms, consuming dryer lint. And the amount of material that worms will eat, you can just, it's virtually endless. It's not, of course, but it's a tremendous amount, much more than most people would think. You can also, vermicompost or vermicast can be used a number of different ways, including as a worm tea. And this fertilizer kind of soil amendment material is obviously, it's all natural. It's 100% recycled material, and it is designed specifically for plants by the worms with Mother Nature. This is in a form, as I mentioned before, the chemical fertilizer is difficult for the plants to take up the nutrients. They can get it, but it takes some effort and a lot is lost. What the worms produce in their castings is perfectly balanced to fit with what the plants need and easily taken up by the plants with their nutrients. So it's a perfect symbiotic relationship, works very well. And honestly, larger farms are starting to look at using worm tea in place of liquid fertilizer, and you don't have any runoff concerns. And even smaller gardeners can use castings and worm tea without any risk of burning their plants. So we're doing this on a commercial scale. So, this is our continuous flow through bin is what it's called. It's in our unheated barn, but protected from the wind and the snow. And what we did was we feed them manure from a neighboring farm just for the consistency of the castings. But you can see we didn't decorate it for the holidays. These are old Christmas rope lights that we put in. And I say old because my brother-in-law was getting rid of them. These are the kind that put off as much heat as they do light, which was perfect for us. So we put them on the inside of the bin. You see the silver on the outside of the bin and on the lid, that's thin insulation. Between the insulation and the rope lights that put out some heat, we keep the worms alive over the winter. They get a little chilly, but they don't freeze and they continue to process the material. For folks raising worms at home, obviously, smaller scale, but part of the benefit, and I'll talk about this a little more, is that you can do this year round. You can do it when it's going to be, -3 or -10 degrees the next couple of nights here. You can do it after a big snowstorm and not have to go outside. You can have this in your laundry room. You can have it in your basement, in any variety of places that you want to have some worms. And if you do it right, there's no odor. This is the one problem with the virtual presentations. The little bin you see on the top there is my sort of demonstration bin, and I bring it and show people that there really is no odor and no issues with a well-run worm bin. So kind of have to take my word for it on this situation here. But you want to have something with opaque sides and a lid, because obviously the worms don't like the light. They see it as sun, which would dry them out. And the bedding material in there you see is some shredded newspaper and some old paper towels and things. And I'll talk a little bit more detail about the bedding and such in a moment. And the question sometimes comes up, well, is vermicompost safe to use? Not just from the plant perspective, but if you're using manure, that's got some concerns about how you handle that and make sure that there's pathogens there. And if you're using rotted food material, that's these are things that obviously you wouldn't want to deal with in large quantities without some sort of care. Uh, but the way that the worms work and the microbes inside of the worms in their gut and put through this material, it really comes out as a very safe material. And you can handle worms and their castings and with bare hands. I would always recommend washing your hands after, but just as you would in any garden situation. Um, there was a very interesting study about whether there was what reduction the worms were able to have on human pathogens in biosolids, or just a nice way of saying sewage. In 2001, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection and Ohio State University used red wigglers, and they did this study to see what kind of reductions they would get when they had the worms eat human sewage. They found an 8.6 log reduction in salmonella and a 6.4 log reduction in fecal coliform. Now, that's pretty cool, but I had no idea what that means. I had to look it up. A log reduction is equal to the relative number of bacteria that was been removed. So a 6 log reduction has basically 6 nines, 99.9999% reduction in salmonella. In the fecal coliform, and the 8 log reduction in salmonella, which is 99 point and followed by 6 nines. So it really is amazing, both the worms and the microbes that are processing the material and turning it into not just valuable plant material, but relatively safe material, certainly as compared to what the starting material was. So how does it help on the gardening side? As I mentioned before, the nutrients are readily available to plants, and the castings actually have a slow release of these nutrients into the soil. So it's not a one quick shot that hits the plant and gives them a fast boost, and then they struggle the rest of the season. It puts it out slowly over time, and you can put castings in a garden bed a couple of times a year, and you'll keep them sustained throughout. They can it can be used for organic growing operations. I mean, we don't technically have our castings certified organic, but it certainly has no chemicals whatsoever, and it's all natural process. So if you look at the image there, this was a study by Washington State University Extension, and they planted carrots, everything else being the same. They used no vermicast in the one on the left, 10% by volume for the one in the middle, and 20% by volume for the one on the right. And you can see the difference that they saw there. And that's really all you need, somewhere between 15 and 20% by volume of vermicast to your soil is going to show you some impressive results. More than that is you're just kind of wasting it because it doesn't really have much of an impact beyond that 20%. Um, you're unlikely to hurt your plants with it, but you just don't need to do that. You can spread it out further. We did a test with a friend of ours who's an avid gardener, provided him with some vermicast at the beginning of last growing season, and he used the same seed tray and planted pepper seedlings. And the left half he didn't put any compost in, just the normal growing mix that he started with, the seedling mix, and on the right side used about 15% by volume. And you can see the difference that he saw there in the same tray. And he was very careful doing this kind of experiment with us where he would make sure to spin the tray so that one side didn't get too much sun or too much draft or anything like that to really see what's the difference. Does this make a difference or not? So I mentioned worm tea a little bit. This is a way to really stretch the benefits of your worm castings or vermicast. Uh, it's a process that uses an oxygenation and a cold brew system. What you're doing is something just generally akin to steeping the vermicast in non-chlorinated water. So if you have well water, you should be okay. If you're on municipal water, you want to let that water sit for like 24 hours without any kind of lid so that the chemical will evaporate off the chlorine. Um, and then what you do is you want to just get this continuously agitated. The larger professional systems have an air pump and they're running the water through. You want to be sure that you're keeping an oxygenated system and oxygenated water there. But this helps you really to stretch out and extend the benefits of the castings. And actually, you're growing more microbes in the water through the castings. They're reproducing in that water. And now you have a good microbe-rich spray. And it won't burn your plants. And the benefits of this have been seen both in a soil drench in terms of getting more nutrients to the roots of the plant, but also in a foliar spray, where if you're spraying some worm tea on the leaves of your plants, it actually helps to reduce the likelihood of different fungal attacks and things like that you might see on some of your plants. And I just put up a very simple sort of ingredient list for making worm tea. Just a cup of worm castings, 1.5 teaspoons of molasses, or you can use things like kelp, stuff like that, and 2-liter bottle of non-chlorinated water. This is as simple as putting this stuff in an old soda bottle, putting the lid on, shaking it up, taking the lid off, put it near somewhere you go regularly, or your door out to the garden in the summer or something like that. Every time you go in and out, put the lid on, shake it up a little bit, take the lid off. It'll keep the air in there. It'll keep it oxygenated by the shaking, and you can then use that. Very simple process, and you'd be amazed at what you see. So I just want to talk a little bit. A lot of folks are familiar with the regular or traditional composting, the hot composting process. So I want to explain a little more clearly some of the differences between the two. Vermicomposting is a cooler mesophilic process versus the thermophilic hot composting process. You can also do a continuous system when you're doing vermicomposting. Just add more food and bedding as it's processed by the worms, and you'll end up with castings at the bottom and the new material up high, and then that will become castings, and then you just keep adding to it. With traditional hot compost pile, you want to do it sort of in a batch system where you get your greens, you get your browns, you mix them together in the right proportion, and then you go from there. Vermicomposting can basically be done in 60 to 90 days from when you put in the bedding and the material, all other things being equal in terms of good moisture content and good temperature and such. And it's about 2 months to as much as 2 years for traditional compost, depending on how it comes together. If you just put a pile out there and you don't turn it regularly and you don't quite have the right moisture and the right um, ratio, it'll take a while, but it'll still break down. Both of them obviously need moisture. And you can actually end up processing more material over the course of a year in certainly a much smaller space with a worm bin. You would need a much larger amount of space to process the same amount of material with the traditional composting process. Although certainly you can compost a larger batch at one time on the traditional side versus with the worms. You don't want to overfeed your worms. And one of the biggest benefits, particularly in the winter in the Adirondacks, is you can do that indoors. You don't need to, get the boots and the coat and jacket and hat and everything else and bring stuff out to a compost pile and shovel your path and such like that. There are some limitations. As I said before, this is not, the perfect scenario that solves every problem in the world. The output is dependent on the input. It depends on what you're feeding the worms and what kind of material you're using. You're still going to get good castings out of this, no matter what, as long as you follow some basic rules. And I'll talk about those in a minute. But if you're using old leaves and leaf mold and feeding the worms, dairy manure from dairy cows, you're going to have a better quality product than if you're feeding them shredded office paper and some carrot peels and cucumber peels. However, that second process is still going to give you excellent castings. You just can't compare them exactly one to the other. There's going to be a variation, but both of them are going to be great for your plants. And that's where the nutrient value of the castings kind of depends on the feedstock, and that's why we use manure for our commercial operation, because we want to have a consistent quality of our castings. Um, Again, you can't go wrong with vermicompost though, using it for your plants. And the one thing to caution about is if you look at a bag of commercial fertilizer in the store, you'll see 10 10 10 or 10 20 15, whatever the numbers are for the nitrogen, potassium, and the NP and K, and now the other one's just flew out of my head. But if you look at these numbers relative to what they are in vermicast, it's much much lower. So if you're trained in traditional thinking to say, well, I want good numbers of NPK, they're here on this bag from Miracle Grow, but they're here down low with the castings. Um, Again, just as a reminder, it's up high in the commercial material because it's harder for the plants to take it in, so they know they need to give them more, which is why you got to be careful about not burning your young seedlings with putting too much. The vermicompost or vermicast is something that is readily taken in by the plants and is a slow release over time. So it works really much better in many ways. Some of the other limitations, it's got to remain moist and oxygenated in the worm bin. You want to make sure that you don't get sealed off where the worms need oxygen and they need moisture, or they'll die if they don't have either one. If you have castings, the castings actually are alive with microbes. And so the same thing for the castings. If you collect your castings, let's say you do your bin in November or December, you had some extra castings after the growing season, and you put them in a Ziploc bag and seal that up nice and tight. You'll keep the moisture in, but the oxygen will become deprived over time, and you'll end up with what looks like good material, but if you look at it under a microscope, it wouldn't have very many beneficial microbes in there at all. Um, Conversely, let's say you put it in a burlap bag and kept it. That's got some good airflow going, and so it'll keep the oxygen, but because of the airflow, it's going to start to dry out. So if you don't keep it moistened in some fashion, then it's going to dry out. The microbes in your castings are going to die, and again, it won't be nearly as effective as it could have been. But if you keep it in the right conditions, you can store your vermicast for up to a year, and it'll still be very very potent for your plants. Um, it is difficult to produce in the winter, especially on a larger scale. But when are you going to want vermicast and this great natural fertilizer and soil amendment? You're going to want it in the springtime. So there's that little bit of a difficulty there. If you're doing it on a home basis and you've got a bin going all year round and through the winter, then you have a little bit of easier time there. The worm tea that I've talked about is perishable. Again, everything here is alive. So there's microbes in that worm tea, and if you need to use it really uh, w- no longer than a day or two after it's made, but ideally within a couple of hours. And the process to do that, you want to have that brewing for at least 24 hours if you can. What we do is we brew it with an air pump for 48 hours, and then try to use it within 4 hours of turning the pump off. Make sure we have absolute peak value for the worm tea. Okay, so let's get to it. How do you produce vermicompost? You need the right type of worm, as I mentioned. Composting worms, red wigglers, European night crawlers. African night crawlers are fine, but they really like hot temperatures, so they're difficult here. And then there's a blue worm, which works as well, but those are much more temperamental, so we don't deal with them here. And I'd kind of recommend new worm farmers not as well. There's different kinds of homes that you can do for the worms. You can do a whole windrow system outdoors with worms, but you've got concerns for predators that are going to get to your worms. You can do a wedge system, which is sort of a modification of a windrow. The CFT, or continuous flow through bin, which I mentioned before, which is where the worms really are sitting in that top, 2 to 6 inches, and processing the material there. And then the castings are getting down, and you're building that up. So then when you're harvesting the castings, you're taking them out from the false bottom of the CFT on the bottom. You're not really disturbing the worms up top. And for smaller operations, those tote bins work very well. You want the right type of bedding and food, the right kind of level of moisture, which is essentially similar to when you take clothes out of a washing machine after the spin cycle. They're not going to be dripping wet, but they're wet. Um, and you need some patience. You don't want to overfeed them. That's one of the biggest problems that new worm farmers do, is they overfeed their worms and then have problems with the bin. And if you can help it, don't disturb them too often. When people start a new worm bin, they're very interested to see how things are going, and they're going to be in there at least once a day, and that's okay. But if you can let them go for a couple of days at a time, even better. And certainly try not to check on them every hour. You want a neutral pH level in the bin, which is fairly easy to maintain if you don't put in too much in the way of acidic materials like citrus and things like that. And if you use crushed eggshells, that will help to balance out the pH. And the temperature is basically same temperature that people like. Between 60 and 80 degrees is really ideal for composting worms, the red wigglers in particular. These guys will be your easiest pets, if you want to call them pets. You don't need to hire a worm sitter if you want to go away, or if you're going to be out, and people aren't going anywhere now. But when the pandemic's over, you can leave a bin alone for a month or more, and the worms should be just fine. They actually will eat their bedding if they run out of the food source that you have in there. So they're not going to starve. They're not going to overtake their bedding or their bin. They will self-regulate their population. So they realize how much space they have and how consistent and how much food is being provided to them. And so they're not going to just all of a sudden one day just say, oh, mackerel, I've got way too many worms. However, if you wanted to expand a worm bin, you just split it in two and take half the worms, put them in a new bin. They'll have more room, more breathing space. You can give them the right amount of food. The first bin will have more space. Now you'll have two bins, and pretty quickly they'll both be at capacity. And again, you can set it up where you want one bin, you're satisfied, two bins, four bins, whatever you want. You can keep growing, or you can stay where you're comfortable. Um, if things start to fall apart in the bin, the worms are going to focus on producing cocoons, a survival of the species instinct. And this is really one of the coolest things that I found. There's a lot of cool things about worms, but the cocoons actually can go dormant. So a cocoon, which has the baby worms in it, will not hatch if the conditions are such that the baby worm is likely to die. Now, scientists have not figured out how the cocoon is able to tell this, but they've been able to see that this happens consistently. If it's too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, the cocoon will kind of go into a stasis, and it just will not hatch the babies until the conditions improve and the worm babies are more likely to survive. The kind of bedding that you want, anything that's good biodegradable material. Shredded paper, shredded cardboard is excellent. You don't have to get a shredder that handles cardboard. You can rip up pieces of cardboard. That works fine. Leaves are good. Aged grass clippings. And as I mentioned, livestock manure, even end of season plants, any of that kind of stuff would be fine as a bedding. The food, any of your fruit peels, pits, cores, stems, seeds, melon rinds, your coffee grounds and filters, your tea bags, but not with the staple, vegetable peelings, corn cobs, husks, any of that stuff is all good material. Eggshells, as I mentioned, you can crush them up and sort of sprinkle them almost like a powder, or you can just put them in whole. It'll take a lot longer to break down, but worms won't care. Things that are left over in your refrigerator that are going bad, but particularly things like salad or fruits and vegetables, and not if you've put salad dressing on it already. Nothing with mayonnaise or oils or vinegars, things like that. Um, these are some of the things now that you want to avoid. Any kind of glossy magazine you don't want. You want to make sure your paper's shredded, because if you put in whole sheets, they'll mat down and close off those spaces for air, so you're not going to get a good oxygenated system. As I mentioned before, you want a good consistent pH level, so you don't want to put in too much citrus. The worms will consume it, but if you're putting in a lot of oranges, pineapple, lemon peels, things like that, it's going to put your bin out of whack in terms of pH, and the worms aren't going to like that. Um, Best to generally avoid things with a strong odor like garlic and onions, meat and dairy products, and as I mentioned, anything in a vinegar base like old pickles or things like that. Um, just to be clear, the worms will consume all of that stuff, but it risks putting the environment of the bin out of whack, or risks attracting vermin and pests that you don't want in your worm bin in your basement or laundry room. So better just to leave those things out. I already mentioned the 60 to 80 degrees, and they like it dark and moist. Um, to ensure that you've got good oxygen in there, you want to put air holes near the top along the side of the bin, and then have a cover over the top. So if you've got your moisture is evaporating, it's going to condense on the top of the bin and then eventually drop back down, and you're going to keep that moisture level consistent throughout. You don't want it to be sopping wet. You don't want to have pooled areas of water. So just briefly now, talking about some of the benefits of vermicompost or vermicast. On the front end, you're diverting a tremendous amount of material from the waste stream and from going to landfills. And it's much simpler and easier in many ways than traditional composting. You can, after you prepared the potatoes and the carrots for dinner, just take those peelings, put them in the bin, and cover them up with a little bedding material so that you don't get fruit flies, and you should be good. You don't have to um, trudge out in the dark and the cold and the snow and such like that to an outdoor bin. It's not particularly expensive to get started, but I will say that the, the pandemic has led to a huge run on worms. Virtually every worm farmer ran out of worms last year. The supply is really tight, and so the prices have gone up, but still it's not overwhelmingly expensive to get started. You don't need any kind of special equipment. Really, the only thing you need is the worms. Otherwise, you probably have everything in your house already, or can pick something up fairly cheap. And then on the back end, of course, you're going to grow much more vibrant seedlings and plants. You'll be able to help your plants and flowers to be more disease resistant. And you can grow larger crop yields, whether you're a commercial farmer, a vegetable gardener, or just a houseplant grower. You can consistently use the same soil and continue to get great results, because you're replenishing the nutrients that the plants are taking out of the soil. So that's kind of our sort of general overview on vermicomposting. So be happy to answer any questions.
Bill, I'll go ahead and kind of chime in, because we had a variety of questions in the chat box and then a couple of ones that were sent to us. So I'll just read the first one. Many clothes are synthetic now. Is it okay to put ones that have the mixed synthetic as far as dryer lint?
It depends on what your end goal is. If your end goal is to have good, clean, pure castings for your garden or for your houseplants, then you probably want to skip that because you will end up with little synthetic fibers in there. If your goal is to reduce the amount of waste that's going in your garbage pail to the extent possible, then absolutely put it in. The worms will ignore what they can't consume. It won't hurt them. It'll just leave you with little bits of material in your bin that is not useful to plants.
All right. The second one is a two-part question. How long should castings be cured? And how about using the liquid that leaks out through the bottom spout of the worm bin?
Yeah. Um, the good thing about castings is they don't need a curing period at all. Traditional compost, once it's finished the active phase, you do want to let that cure for a while, and that continues to improve the quality of that compost. With the worm castings, as soon as you know you've got good castings there, and you take them out of the bin, they're ready to use immediately. So there's no issue with that. In terms of the material, the liquid that can get out of the bottom of a bin, um, that's a lot of led to a lot of confusion from new first time worm bin owners. There are a bunch of commercial worm bins that are set up with a spigot at the bottom. So you'd think, okay, so I should be getting some liquid out of this, but you really shouldn't. If you have a good, well managed bin, there shouldn't be any liquid coming out of the bottom. The reason I think that those manufacturers did that is because people that are just starting out end up with a bin that's too wet. And that's an easy way to get that liquid out and sort of modify the moisture level in the bin. But that's leachate. It's not worm tea. And I would not recommend using that. You can go online and see, a ton of debates on that, whether it's beneficial or not beneficial. It's likely anaerobic material, and anaerobic microbes are not always the good guys like the aerobic ones are. So I would recommend against using that.
Okay. Can you add dog or pet waste?
Technically, you can, but I would strongly recommend against it. Um, I just, I mean, like I said, that there was that study where they were looking at human sewage and they found a huge reduction in, some of the pathogens. But that was, a scientific study under controlled circumstances that most people aren't going to do. I would recommend against it.
All right. Do castings generate heat?
No, I'm not certain if that question means if you have a lot of castings in your bin, is it going to get too hot? If that's the question, then no. Um, if they mean like, will too much castings? I guess maybe if we could clarify that question, but generally no. But I'm not certain what they mean.
Okay. Just to piggyback off of that one, if people are putting their worms in a tote, like you were recommending for smaller operations, will it be heated appropriately, just kept indoors, or do they need to add a separate heating mat or anything else to it?
No, as long as you keep it indoors, even if you have it in an unfinished cold basement, you could keep it in a garage if the garage doesn't get below about 35 degrees. Worms can survive. The red wigglers in particular can survive down to about 35 degrees. They'll really slow down. They're mostly going to focus on just trying to keep some warmth and just basically stay alive. But they will survive at down about 35 or so degrees. Much lower than that, they'll start to die off. And if it gets well below freezing, if it gets into the 20s or something, you're not likely going to have any living worms after that. And on the other end, they can handle up to about 90, 92, maybe 95 degrees on the heat, and they'll still be alive. Again, they'll get really slow. They won't process very much material, but they'll still be alive. Once you get into the higher 90s or 100 degrees, they're going to start dying off. So, and if you have a bin that you put outside in the summer, it may only be 88 degrees out, but if you've got that sitting in a baking sun, particularly if you have a dark bin and it's going to absorb a lot of heat, inside that bin could get quite hot. So you know, the temperature where they can survive, I would say 35 to 95 basically, but the temperature where they're really going to thrive and continue to process at a good rate is between 60 and 80 degrees.
All right. And I think you kind of covered this one, but is printed cardboard okay for bedding?
If there's some writing on the cardboard, some kind of printed material, generally that'll be okay. But if it's a plastic sticker or a shipping label, um, you'd want to try to get that off. Try to get any tape off or that you can. Glue is actually okay. May take quite a while for it to break down, but any tape or synthetic plastic or sticky labels, if you can, you know, try to get those off. They're not likely to hurt the worms. They're just gonna, you know, give you lower quality material at the end that you're gonna have to sort of pick out.
All right. Would citrus fruit peels or pineapple rinds with little or none of the fruit add too much acid?
It all depends. Unfortunately, that's the answer for a lot of things. It depends, but if you're putting you know, a little bit in at a time, then you're probably not going to have an issue. If you put in, you know, if you've got a whole section of pineapple skin or rind that you put in, and it's a very small bin, and there's not a lot of bedding in there, that's going to be difficult and cause some problems for you. If you're only putting in orange peels and lemon peels, that's going to probably cause you some problems. But if you've got, you know, the peel of one orange and, you know, three banana peels and, you know, some lettuce that's wilted and, you know, a bunch of cardboard bedding and such like that, you'll probably be okay. One of the best things to do is when you're feeding the worms, it's a process called pocket feeding, where if you figure you have a rectangular bin, you can divide that into 6 sections. So cut it in half, and then 1, 2, 3, and then same 3 on the other side. So start in one corner and put the food there. And then if the worms like it, they'll come right over and they'll find that food pretty quickly. And if it's got some issues that's going to be difficult for them, they've got somewhere else in the bin to go to get away from it. So rather than sprinkling it across the entire top of the bin, now they've got really nowhere else to go to get away from it.
All right. Do we need to buy a specialty bin?
No, not at all. You can get just any kind of Rubbermaid tote, or doesn't have to be Rubbermaid, but any kind of plastic tote bin works well. There are a wide range of different types of things. There's you know, some commercial ones. There's some stacking bins that a lot of places offer. I don't really like those. The point of those is you set up the first level, and it's like a screen at the top of that. And then once the worms kind of process that material, you theoretically then you put the second level on and start with some bedding, fresh bedding and food in that, and the worms will work their way up. It's almost the reverse of a continuous flow through bin. You're making the worms come up and keeping the castings down low. But everything that I've heard from folks that have tried those, they struggle with them and doesn't really work very well. But you can try any of the commercial bins certainly, and you can. I had a worm bin made out of a cardboard banker's box with a garbage bag inside. I mean, you wouldn't just use a cardboard box; the thing would disintegrate. But I lined it with a plastic garbage bag, and I used that for more than a year. It worked fine.
And it's a little bit more cost effective, right?
Oh yeah.
All right. How do we get the castings out without disturbing the worms?
If you don't have a continuous flow through bin, that's really the only way to do it without disturbing the worms. And that, if you're setting up any kind of continuous flow through bin, doesn't have to be the size of what we have in our barn, which is 4 foot wide by 8 foot long by 4 foot high. You can do it any sort of way, but however you do a continuous flow through bin, you start with a low level, and then you continue to add to that and continue to add to that and then the worms continue to eat in that top couple of inches, and then you harvest from the bottom, and the worms are up here, and they don't care. Um, so that's really the only way that you can do it without bothering the worms. But in terms of bothering, they don't really care. They get a little out of sorts maybe, but not for long. It doesn't cause difficulties, and it doesn't cause any long-term problems with them. Um, and the best way to do it with a tote is you dump the contents out, either on a plastic sheet or on an old table or something like that, and it's called a light harvesting method. Depending on how much material you have and how big your bin is, you might want to set up 2 or 3 piles or just have one, sort of have it almost in a pyramid style or mounded shape, and slowly just wipe away any of the castings and material that you see. You'll start to see some worms. Have a bright light or the sun or something overhead. About 10 minutes, take a break for about 10 minutes, come back. Now you'll scrape away the next level of the castings. And then when you start to see worms, again, 10-minute break, the worms that you're seeing on the top, because of the light, are going to burrow their way further into that pile. You do that multiple times, and you'll eventually have all the castings off to the side, and you'll have just a pile of worms, and then you set them up in a new bin with fresh bedding.
And so you don't need to screen that at all, even for the food that's partially broken down?
It all depends on personal preference. I mean, if there's partially decomposed food, you can put that in a in a vegetable garden, and if you're going to work it into the soil a little bit, that'll be fine. If you didn't want to do that, you could certainly screen it. You could also screen the whole process. You could take everything and run it with a hand screen of some sort and shake through, and most of your worms will be left on the screen with your castings below. The difficulty is getting a small enough level screen, a tight enough mesh in the screen to try to make sure you keep the castings separate from the cocoons, because the cocoons will get through with the castings when the worms are kept on top. Um, but in terms of just, generally, if you don't have a screen or don't want to do a screening process, the light harvesting method works. And then you're on that closely so you can see casting or the cocoons at that point.
Okay, this one has a couple parts to it. Do you know about Asian jumping worms, and do they self-regulate if conditions are off? They're invading Columbia County.
Um, I by no means an expert on them. I have heard of them. I can't talk specifically to those, but I can just, on a more general note, talk about, there has been concerns about sort of an invasive species of worm coming in. Particularly, I think in the Midwest, they were looking at these worms that were um, too quickly consuming the decaying organic matter, the leaf litter and such in forests, and actually causing harm to the trees and the other small invertebrates and animals that live down in the leaf litter or the forest floor. Um, the question then became, well, wait a minute now, red wigglers, I don't want, what if some of mine get out, and what happens if they, I don't want to be causing a potential, invasive species issue in this area. Um, there's been a bunch of study about it, and all of the scientific reviews that have been done, all of the the experts that have looked at this have said red wigglers. First of all, they are not the worms that are causing the concern, and they can't really survive our winters because, as I said, if it gets below freezing, they're going to die. And they are not deep burrowing worms. I mean, the earthworms that you see in the spring, summer, and fall, and then you don't see in the winter, have burrowed down below the frost line. The red wigglers wouldn't do that. They'd stay within that top, 4 to 6 inches. You get enough cold days, they're going to freeze to death, and so that they're not going to do well if you try to just put them out on their own. Um, Asian jumping worms, I've heard of them, but I don't know a lot about them.
All right, how often would you feed them?
You want to let the worms tell you that. It's going to depend on how many you have, how big your bin is, and what kind of food you're giving them. Some people actually grind up their food, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend, but you can do it. generally the best way to do it is to get to where you're feeding them about once a week. So start with, I would suggest starting with about half of the weight of your worms approximately. So if you have a half pound or a pound of worms, start with a quarter pound or a half pound of food waste. Do that pocket feeding. Maybe don't put it all in one corner if you have a small bin. Hopefully you have a slightly larger one, but put it in one area. And then cover it with some bedding so that you don't end up with fruit flies. And then just check on that every so often. If your worms go through the amount of food that you set aside for them in just 2 or 3 days, then you'll want to feed them even more. If after a week there's still quite a bit of food left, just leave it, let it sit, and see how long it takes. And then next time when it's finally gone and you do refeed, feed them much less. So you'll find a point where about once a week for feeding is good.
All right. My castings are rich and helpful, but don't look crumbly and uniform look like what I've bought. Why is this? Is it maybe because of what they are eating?
It's most likely the moisture content. A lot of small worm farmers and worm bin owners, they have their bins a little bit too wet, and particularly this is difficult with the totes or plastic bin that you have at home. You don't want to disturb the worms all the time, but if you sort of run through the material once a month and just get your hand in there or get a small spade or something like that and just stir things up a little bit, that'll help it from becoming too compacted and almost solidifying into a hard rock type substance.
Okay, this is for your worm farm. Do your worms come with complete instructions and phone or email support if needed?
Yes, actually, we do. We have a sort of an instruction sheet that we provide, and always happy to help folks. And I in no way I'm not trying to make this any sort of a sales pitch, so I try to avoid that. This is more just education. But what we're looking at actually this coming year is selling um, starter bins where it's got everything you need right off the bat to begin with, rather than selling just a pound of worms and then you have to figure out, is this the right bedding, is it the right moisture and such like that. But
Yeah, I would definitely buy that. And this is from Bernadette. She said her worm bin is thriving, and if anyone wants some, she can help get them started. And if you need to message anybody on here, there's a way to message just one person if that's something that you're interested in. And the last question is, do the normal worms, quote unquote, do any composting?
not really. What they do is actually they do consume some soil and the microbes that are in the soil, but they're not breaking down the decaying organic matter. But what they are doing is burrowing and aerating your soil, and the castings that they leave behind are also beneficial to your plants. So they're definitely good. No disrespect to those worms, but they're not really composting. And if you try to get some of those worms that you see after a rainstorm and put them in a bin and feed them like you would as described in this process, they wouldn't be happy and they wouldn't survive.
All right. It looks like, oh wait. Um, one more question. So if I do a curbside pickup, can you vermicompost this amount in the basement in the bins? So the same amount that would be in a bucket, like a 3.5 or 5 gallon bucket.
Um, Generally, no. Unless you have quite a few worm bins or one really big one, um, you're probably going to have too much material in a 5 gallon or 3.5 or 4 gallon bucket for a worm bin, for a home worm bin. It's going to be a little bit. You're going to overwhelm the worms, and then you're going to run into other issues and get into some of the problems of overfeeding.
Okay. I think that's it for the questions, Bill. I've learned a lot, and I'm definitely going to have to try it out. I've always been a backyard composter, so this is something new to try. I'm excited about it. Thank you guys so much for attending. if you'd like more information about Bill, he has his website up on the corner there, AdirondackWormFarm.com. Check out his site. He's very helpful. And then if you have any questions or anything about Sustainable Saratoga, check us out at sustainablesaratoga.org. We're always looking for new topics of interest, so please forward those on to us. And we're always looking for volunteers that are passionate about sustainability and helping the environment. So if that's something that you're interested in, please contact us at info@sustainablesaratoga.org or send me a private chat, me or Wendy a private chat. Thank you guys for coming, and we hope that you have much composting success, vermicomposting success in the future.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you guys.